Alvin Bragg, thank you so much for joining us here on the 25th hour. I really appreciate you spending your time with us this morning. I think I'm
Thank
just,
you. Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
it's my pleasure. I am going to just go right off the bat and ask you our first question. I'm a little obligated to ask you this, but why do you feel you should become the next Manhattan District Attorney instead of your other 7 or 8 colleagues?
No, I think that is I like you start there because that's uh, a great place to start. I look at the office of DA and the position of district attorney really as having three top kind of qualification tranches, if you will. The first is management. It's as you know, an office that's there's a number of lawyers, a lot of staff, a lot of responsibility. We need someone who knows how to manage. As you know, I was the number 2 lawyer in the New York State Attorney General's office. I've overseen a large law enforcement office and know how to manage around change, create culture. I think that's really important. And there's no other person who's had a similar role in terms of management oversight with the scope and breadth that I've had. So I think that's the first issue is management. The second is, what are we managing? Which is litigation, which cases to bring and which not to bring. The breadth and depth of my litigation experience, the only one in the race who's done both kind of, public safety prosecution, the kind of impactful prosecutions I worked on as a federal prosecutor at the State Attorney General's office, and civil rights litigation, representing through the law school and the Racial Justice Project, Eric Garner's mother in a lawsuit against the city. And then the nature of the cases, whether it's doing the Trump Foundation case, whether it's bringing the lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein, whether it's prosecuting someone who laundered millions of dollars in drug money for a violent organization, or whether it's Wall Street prosecuting a former majority leader of the state Senate for public corruption, or Wall Street advisors. I've done the full scope, and so I think that's the second really important tranche of qualification. And the third is, I think it's time we have someone who's lived these experiences. We've had 3 elected DAs in more than 75 years. I don't think we've had a DA who, like myself, has been stopped at gunpoint by the NYPD during an unlawful stop. I don't think we've had a DA who's, had a loved one come live with him post incarceration like I have.
Mm.
And really have just lived every part of this. We was a part of a conversation the other day talking about the warrant squad. It's like, I've had an officer bang on my door at 6 a.m. to effect the warrant looking for someone, a loved one who used to live with me. So I really lived the whole experience in addition to sort of working it. So I think those 3 characteristics: management, litigation, and the lived experience is what we need our next DA. And I think that sets me well apart from the rest of the field.
I appreciate that answer, and I'm going to say this in the introduction. Full disclosure to our listeners: Alvin was my professor at New York Law School for criminal investigations, and it was adjudication, I believe, as opposed to, I think it was procedure was the first prong of the criminal investigations kind of classes. So yeah, Mr. Bragg was my professor. He was a great professor, and so apart from why you believe you're better than the rest, basically, this is an interesting legal job in the sense that the way you interview for it is you campaign for it, and it's a different animal than being just a regular politician. And so recently you got the New York Times endorsement, and how does do you feel momentum at your back? Do you how different is it having to convince voters of your legal acumen as opposed to, what are you going to do, just writing laws, for example, as a regular politician? Do you feel, first question is, do you feel momentum? And the second question is, how does it feel in general?
So I'll add a question before the first one, which was that for me, it was personally very gratifying.
Mm,
I'm a lifelong New Yorker, and I can recall growing up and, my mother very much believing the Times was the paper of record, and preparing for, really even before high school, well before high school, she's saying, well, this will help with your vocabulary. You need to read the Times every Sunday. Which I confess I did not do every Sunday, and when I did, I usually grabbed the sports section. But for me, I thought of those words, my late mother, and how much this would be of meaning to her. And I think there are a lot of voters in Manhattan, I don't think I know, who look to the Times and the Times editorial board for the its view on elections of significance. And so I think there's no doubt that it's very, very impactful in this election in particular, for the reasons you say. It's not just not a legislative position, not just kind of mayoral one where things are sort of bound up in other kind of political issues, but one where I think people are really looking to, okay, how do I assess whether someone's a good lawyer and how they can do these cases? And that's not something that we're doing in every type of election. So I think here probably there's even more weight put on the endorsement. So I feel it out in the streets. I've been out a bunch of times since the endorsement, and as I'm shaking hands and meeting voters or bumping fists,
right.
Maybe they're telling me about it, and they've read it and they've processed it, and they've got questions. It also flags significant work I've done and parts of my bio. So I do feel like it's very helpful. Now, with that said, we're obviously going to there's 3 weeks, about less than 3 weeks now before primary day. So we're going to be out, continuing to meet voters, talk about the Times endorsement, talk about my work as a federal prosecutor, talk about my work as a civil rights lawyer, talk about our other endorsements, Preet Bharara, Congressmember Nadler, Zephyr Teachout, Congressmember Rangel, and really, we're building a coalition, a network of all around the borough of people who are care about both fairness and safety. So feeling good, but lots of work to do between now and primary day.
Yeah, it's written that you have a very successful coalition in the sense that your structure is, I think you started coalescing allies around Harlem, right? You're based in Harlem and maybe branching out. If I read that to be correct.
100% correct. So I'm a lifelong, Harlemite. I grew up here, and when we started out, initially in the campaign, the first, public endorsers were, lifelong Harlem leaders: C. Virginia Fields, former Manhattan Borough President, Inez Dickens, Al Taylor, both in the Assembly, Senator Robert Jackson. And so I think a lot of people saw that support and said, okay, he's got some Harlem support. Okay. It was very meaningful to me because many of them have been long-term mentors. This also, I've never done this before. And so several of them have run races. C. Virginia Fields having run a Manhattan borough-wide race successfully.
Yeah.
But then I think when we started, really kind of cascading throughout the borough, so the political clubs, 15 have endorsed me. That's more than twice that of any other candidate. And so I think that's all the way down from, the Lower East Side, the Village, Chelsea, all the way up. And then the unions, a number of unions have endorsed. And so we're building a coalition. And I think really on the core thesis that folks care about both safety and fairness, and that they're inextricably linked, and that we can have both, and having a mature conversation about, how you have to have both, how you need one for the other. You can't really separate them out and have them as separate conversations.
What was the learning curve like? You mentioned you haven't done this before. What was the learning curve like on the campaign trail?
Extraordinary. This is unlike it is. So, you had me in my first semester of teaching in any endeavor. I taught before, not at New York Law School, but not that kind of heavy doctrinal class like criminal procedure. And that was a learning curve. But, I'd been to law school, I'd sort of, had some context. Here, I know how to run a government office. I know how to litigate. I know how to talk in court. This is very different. And, so one thing that, I do now that I didn't do at the beginning is the rest of people actually really care about, kind of why I'm doing this and what got me to do it, as opposed to not just the policies. People want to know what you're going to do, but they really want to know what motivates you. So when I first started, it was a real struggle for me to talk personally about, being stopped at gunpoint by the NYPD 3 times. That wasn't something that I'd done in any public way before, or talking about having had a gun pointed at me 3 times about people who weren't police officers. So really learning that's important for people, that getting that context for sort of why I've done the work. I know it because I've lived it, but sharing and sort of becoming someone, you want the public office, you need to earn the public trust. And that's not just saying, hey, I did these cases and I'm a good lawyer. Folks want to know that, but they want to know not just that, and not just what you'll do, but sort of why are you doing this? Who are you?
Right.
And that was that did not that wasn't intuitive for me. I was sort of almost, to put it in law school terms, approaching this initially, like a appellate argument,
Uh,
like moot court, as opposed to, it's more like mock trial, right?
uh,
It's more, uh, uh, um, it's not just the sort of pristine legal issues crystallized. It is, everything, explaining yourself, telling why. And so it's been very interesting. I've learned a lot about running for office. And I think I've really enjoyed, particularly as we've been able to be out and about the last month, talking in person to people. I think we've probably all enjoying that more,
mhm,
having not had a lot of it the last year. It's been very interesting in the context of the campaign to now be out and not on a Zoom screen, but talking to
mhm.
people, hearing their concerns and talking about my experiences and really have an exchange. I've really enjoyed that part of it.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I mean, all of the voters of Manhattan are now a judge as compared to just one judge you'd have to talk to or a panel of judges on the appellate side. I mean, even your policy proposals on your website kind of read like a brief. I was reading your one of your policy proposals the other day for research before this interview, and so you mentioned when you're talking to voters, a big thing for them is balancing safety and fairness. And so one of my questions to you, because it's starting to be brought up a lot in the debates, in the conversations, how would you reassure voters if you make it past the primary, or even now as you're debating your fellow Democratic candidates who are worried about not just your ideas, but the ideas coming from the Democratic side of things to decline prosecuting low-level crimes while also focusing on police corruption, for example. So, citywide candidates are grasping onto rising crime as a big theme in their campaigns. I think a big poster poster boy for this right now is Eric Adams, who has really started taking on the public safety side of the debate as a law and order type of thing. And then you have conservative outlets like the Post that they're blaming kind of liberal reforms such as bail reform for a perception that criminals are now running around free and cops are just being punished. So how would you reassure a New York City Manhattan voter that isn't exactly in the progressive lane, who's now reading all these headlines about subway safety, and then they hear about you declining to prosecute low level crimes? How would you go about reassuring them?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important piece, because I think what I propose is going to allow us to get to the kind of cases that people are concerned about. And this does go back to sort of merging the lived experience and the work experience. So I, I- I'm I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'm the only one in the DA's race who's had a gun pointed at them.
Hmm.
I'm talking about the police. I'm talking about what you would consider, a street incident. Within the last week, within a 24-hour span of each other, I had a gun incident one block north of me and another 2 blocks south of me.
Mm.
Uh, Responded and assisted a loved one whose best friend was gunned down in front of him, and anyone who's seen the blank stare in the loved one's eyes. So I know this stuff is sort of what I'm saying. And so the truth is, for far too long, we have had low clearance rates, meaning in terms of actually solving these incidents, and getting anything approaching accountability for these incidents. And so I don't think the answer is, I have a list of things I wouldn't decline,
Hmm.
uh, that I would decline to prosecute. They're soaking up so much bandwidth in our system and crowding out the things that really have to do with public safety. I think the things that people are sitting around the kitchen table talking about, the things that the editorial boards are opining about.
Mm.
It's not, the person who is got a resisting arrest but charged with nothing else. It's not the person who was, disorderly conduct. Uh, so we need to, in particular, move away from those, and I think talk about the things that people are fearful about, these gun incidents. And so I've done that work. I've done gun prosecutions. When I was at the state attorney general's office, we did a look at every single gun found at a crime scene and traced it back to its last lawful sale from a licensed firearm dealer. And the data is illuminating. It's a literal blueprint to the kind of cases we should be doing.
Mm.
And that's what I've done throughout my career, kind of cases where you follow the contraband, you follow the money to the most culpable, you hold them accountable, and then you get enduring public safety.
Mm.
So I really hold my record up, for people who have those concerns. And on the specific issue of bail reform, I wrote an op-ed this summer. The data just doesn't support the contention of the New York Post and others that bail reform caused this. I mean, some of those claims were made 2 weeks into bail reform being
Right,
enacted.
right.
So it's like, what are we talking about? You don't have the data yet. And so I wrote an op-ed sort of looking at the data and saying that, there's really no, the NYPD's own data, I should know, no showing of causation between bail reform and these gun incidents. But still, we got to focus on it, right? I mean, safety is important. The perception of safety is important. And that's why I've worked on, these issues. And, just as much as I, went into this line of work for police accountability, it was 6 gunpoint incidents growing up, 3 the police and 3 not. So I went into police accountability and public safety. And the last thing I would say to your question is, what I say to law enforcement partners is, we are never going to have public safety without community trust, right? So the number one civil right is the right to be able to walk safely to your corner. So public safety is key, but we're never going to have actual public safety if the community doesn't trust the officers, because then we don't have victims who will come forward. We don't have witnesses. We can't do our work without community trust. And so that requires holding law enforcement accountable when they, don't tell the truth, when they use excessive force. So I see it as a public safety issue, right? We holding police officers accountable is a part of public safety. I mean, I tried a case for a federal FBI agent who we convicted for lying at trial, and I had some in law enforcement say, "Why are you doing that case? Like, you're working with us, you're a prosecutor." I said, "Look, do you lie? Do you obstruct justice? Your beef's not with me, it's with him. He's making your job harder because he's in effect ruining your brand as an FBI agent." So I think this is a important, nuanced conversation that we have to have, and that I want to continue to have as DA. And I think what I've specialized in throughout my career, serving both as a prosecutor and as a civil rights lawyer, is having these conversations and connecting public safety and civil rights. And I think that's what we need to continue to do.
Now, my understanding is there is an MOU with the NYPD Legal Bureau when it comes to the DA's office about, how the police kind of issue summonses. And if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. Your declination policy, does it involve taking another look at that memorandum of understanding with the Legal Bureau? Because I think a large point of contention, for example, when there were protesters last summer, if they're not being arrested, they were getting hit with summonses to show up. And that's always been cited as sort of like a headache. If you get issued a summons, you have to take a day off work to show up at the desk window and deal with the summons ticket and things of that nature. So are you familiar with that? And if so, do you plan on taking another look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental premise here is that the district attorney has to have authority over, and does, over kind of what cases are prosecuted and how. And I know the current district attorneys delegated some of that to the NYPD. That is the district attorney's job to figure out what crimes are charged and what are not charged, and that needs to be done in a objective way, independent from the NYPD. It's why we've gone to law school and why we're sort of trained, and that's our function. And so would really focus on that independence. I mean, I really want to change the way the intake unit at the DA's office is staffed. Right now that function, so who runs that, rotates. There's no full-time senior staff person in charge of that, and so I want to change that. And I think it's important. It's important. We have this sense from TV of Law and Order, the first 30 minutes of the show and the second 30 minutes of the show, and generally whatever gets brought on Law and Order ends up getting done on the second 30 minutes of the show. And we got to have a real check there in terms of what who's making that decision to go forward. That's the DA's decision.
And what I'm also interested in hearing about, you've pointed to early experiences facing police misconduct as well as what you called street incidents. Um, and it's a big, I feel like it's crazy that, white New Yorkers are only like waking up to this recently. Yeah, and there are plenty of white New Yorkers that have had their own um, situations as well. I've had a gun drawn on me in in the street in Bensonhurst, of all places. But at the same time, when I was a kid, I had stupid incidents with alcohol on the street, and I had a cop telling me to stay the f out of my own neighborhood before, very aggressively, and I think many New Yorkers have these sort of recollections, sort of memories, but it is so disproportionately placed on Black New Yorkers and Black Americans throughout the country. So what I wanted to ask from you is you've spoken about these experiences as a young teen, as a young child, and then you mentioned just now that as an adult you still hear about gunshots blocks from your house. Um, have there been incidents in, if you're in your memory as an adult, that drive your platform to combat police misconduct, combat gun violence? Is there anything you can recall, even maybe while you were being a lawyer or a prosecutor, of experiencing either police misconduct against yourself? Um, because you hear all the time, even senators, state senators and congressional senators, for example, they say that they get followed in the grocery store still. And so I wanted to hear if there's anything you can remember.
Yeah, there are a number, and maybe I'll try to think of a couple illustrative ones. I mean, one I alluded to earlier, I believe I was working as a federal prosecutor there, and I remember I was up pretty early because I guess it was my younger child was a infant or a toddler. I remember crawling, and that's why I was up very early. And bang at the door, and it was someone from the warrant squad, the NYPD, looking for my brother-in-law who had been incarcerated, had been staying with me, and I said, like, what are you doing? Like, it's 5 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
and you're trying to affect this warrant for an open bottle, for
Oh,
like,
wow.
like it's 5 a.m. I've got my, my toddler here. You're waking up my family. And it was actually one of the few times where I kind of felt like I was, because I was in government there as a prosecutor. And so I said, look, I got cases where people are really being harmed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like we should be working on those cases. I remember standing at my doorstep and really, metaphorically pushing back. And just really kind of talking about some of the things I've been talking about in the campaign about where are our priorities here, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're out at 5 a.m. knocking on how many doors over an open bottle.
Yeah.
And we've got, shootings going on. And that's kind of what I mean about the system just being this misplaced emphasis on sort of control and order and not actual, safety. I don't think anyone would make an argument. And he and I had this back and forth where, he basically said, like, yeah, no, I'm doing my job. And I said, I get that. And he, determined a way to kind of talk to my brother-in-law and figure out a way to go meet at the courthouse,
Yeah.
and so that's one. Professionally, one that sticks with me is, preparing an officer to testify. This is not a forced one. And as you know, from that criminal procedure class, the obligations of, disclose, cross-examination material, we call it giglio, as you know, and asking and eliciting from the officer that he'd been found incredible to have, lied by a federal judge.
Mm-hmm.
And he was still testifying. And I said, and he kind of got his back up against me, like, why are you asking me these questions? Like, well, the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah.
And more kind of, I'm saying, and this is what's supposed to happen. So I think professionally, I've had a number of experiences. And then personally, it doesn't sort of go away, in adult life. I mean, one of the most sobering things for me, as a father, so I've got an 11-year-old and a 15-year-old at the beginning of the pandemic. My son was, very astute, understands COVID and the importance of wearing a mask, telling me that he didn't want to wear a mask because he was concerned that the police would think he was a robber and they would harm him. And so, this kind of, the notion that an 11-year-old is having that thought, shows that sort of how we are sort of internalizing this, and the real significance, the real importance of addressing these issues. As I said, going back to obviously important for him as a person, but then more broadly, like the perception of police and the trust, so that we can have true kind of community-based public safety.
Thanks for sharing that, actually. And I know it's difficult, definitely, to share that. And I really appreciate that drives your campaign forward, and it drives your policies forward. And so I wanted to briefly touch upon the idea that you took on as a civil rights lawyer, actually representing Eric Garner's mom, Gwen Carr. Um, and I actually was amazed that what you are trying to do, at least in the courts, is to try to get the mayor and the former police commissioner O'Shea to testify about their own line of thinking when it came to the Eric Garner incident. And it's like putting the politician on blast, basically making them testify as to what their state of mind was, what actions they took, when they learned about an incident like Eric Garner, and what actions they took afterward. And it's a little unusual, as well, as I've read, because it's a judicial inquiry that's based on, a statute in the city charter, not a statute, but a portion of the city charter that just isn't being used, right? The city, I think, even tried arguing that, the police weren't obligated to uh, basically explain themselves to you and Gwen Carr. So can you talk a little bit about, how that case is going, and basically how does your legal representation um, jibe with your run for office? Is what's going to happen if you win the primary, and how does that kind of look like?
Yeah. So I'll start where you left off with that. So we are scheduled right now to have a summary proceeding, sort of
Mm,
akin to a trial, but not, as you say, it's a bit different. Having witnesses come in, and it's for transparency. We're seeking the answers are the relief itself, and so we're tentatively scheduled for July 19th. So
mhm,
if that day holds, then this matter will be resolved. Long before we have after the primary date, but long before anyone, the DA is installed, new DA. This is a case that has been a true privilege to work on. It is one that, you're right, we brought under a provision of the city charter that is seldom used, that requires city officials to testify under oath when a judge so requires, based upon normal everyday folks coming forward, and with a showing that there's been a violation or neglect of a duty. So here, we say, various violations and neglect. So, there have been questions about the stop of Mr. Garner, the medical treatment of Mr. Garner. There are key facts we don't know, like all of the witnesses who were there. Going back to truth telling, there was a officer who was at the scene, assisted with the arrest, went back to his precinct, filled out paperwork saying that no force was used arresting Mr. Garner. We know that was not true.
mhm,
This officer is still on the force and has not been disciplined. We allege that that's a neglect of duty to oversee, respond and to discipline officers. And the relief is to bring them into court, and they should ask him these questions. What did you do in response? Did you talk to the officers and ask why no treatment was given, other than just checking for a pulse? Was there an investigation done on that? If so, what were
mhm.
the interviews? What were the result?
Yeah.
This officer who's on the force who said no force was used. Did you interview? Was there discipline? They said there's no discipline. Why not?
Mhm.
And that's what we're looking at. I was in court just last week in the first department, for your non-lawyer viewers, for an appellate court in New York, where the city has appealed. They're trying to get the appellate court to say no, don't have this summary proceeding. And so I was in court arguing just last week. So I will continue. I'm doing that, in my capacity, not as a candidate, but as a visiting professor at New York Law School and co-director of New York Law School Racial Justice Project. And it's been a privilege to do it. I will continue to do it. Obviously, if elected district attorney, then I will have a different job and no longer be at New York Law School. But if it stays on the schedule, we'll have the proceeding in July, so long before even the general election.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely look out for updates on that case. And with great accomplishments such as that, really taking that lawsuit to the city, and we'll see what happens with that. But with your other great accomplishments, there come uh, examples that we like you characterized before. They're painful, and some of your fellow candidates, like Lucy Lang, recently at the debate, pointed to your time at the state attorney general office to say that uh, you didn't bring any cops to account. Essentially, is what she was trying to say. I I just want to make clear to our viewers that you have brought cases against uh, officers accused of police misconduct. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's incredibly difficult with our legal system and the statutes in place. Their legal shield is just impenetrable almost. We're seeing things start to slowly fall down with, like we could point to Derek Chauvin being convicted. And here in New York, there's very, very, very few examples of officers actually being convicted of their own wrongdoing. Um, you know, can you maybe speak to your hopes? What would you do as a DA to maybe try to chip away at that legal shield? Um, and sorry about that. I have a tiny little dog.
No worries.
Um, and you know, would you maybe so let's start with that question. What are your hopes and dreams about that in a sense? Like what do you think you can do about that as DA?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and talk about what I have been doing, and this is really the through line, right? So there's a straight line from being stopped 3 times at gunpoint in unconstitutional stops by the NYPD to going to law school to my first significant case as a young lawyer was suing the state police for excessive force against my then clients, more than 100 members of the Onondaga Nation, for excessive force during a peaceful political and religious protest. Then as a federal prosecutor prosecuting, go to trial and get a conviction from an FBI agent. And then, bringing 2 really important cases, one for, murder against an NYPD officer, and another against a sitting district attorney for essentially, we allege, tanking a case of an officer he knew who had shot at and killed someone. And as you said, now, representing Ms. Carr. So I've done this at every stage. Thing, but to have the candidate criticize me who to my knowledge hasn't done any of these kind of cases. And as you said, they're challenging. They're challenging cases for a couple of reasons. I think we saw this in the Chauvin trial. We saw the kind of what I call the black boogeyman defense. Again, here's this person laying lifeless, but all of a sudden the defense is trying to shift the focus to this larger than life, extra strength person. So you've got to deal with with that, trying to keep that out of the courtroom,
Hmm.
and the legacy of racism in the country in the case. Then we have the substantive law, which gives a lot of deference to police officers. So
Hmm.
and when I say painful, that's what's like being with the families in those moments, and knowing that we've poured everything into those 2 cases I mentioned, and then having the result be not what we think it is. You charge an officer with murder, that's very serious. So in my view, someone charged with murder is still on the force. That is painful. But I would say the number one thing, and the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, just came forth with a legislative package, and I've been writing on this, wearing my hat as a professor, going back a couple of years, changing the law. I mean, right now, a police officer can use lethal force, and it doesn't have to be the last resort. So changing the law to make clear that a police officer cannot use lethal force unless that officer's or a third person's life is in jeopardy or serious physical injury, unless it's a matter of last resort. They've done everything else they could do. We need to do that. We need to change that. That's really, really important.
Hmm.
And then there are other things, there's legislative solutions in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act on making it so that a police officer can't be disciplined in one department and then just go to another. We don't know, the new department doesn't know about the history. So having a nationwide, a database. And then as district attorney, the jurisdiction for the death cases is going to be with the Attorney General's office. That's the law. That's the unit I upheld and ran when I was the AG's office. But there's incredibly important cases to do with excessive force where someone doesn't die. So doing those, and then the kind of case I talked about earlier with officers, not telling the truth, holding them accountable for that. So for that, I would do what I did at the Attorney General's office: have a standalone unit that reports to me because of my expertise in this area, that doesn't work side by side with the NYPD, but exclusively just investigating them. So they're siloed, and that bringing cases and doing that in a very transparent way. And when we don't bring a case, again, to be transparent about that. At the AG's office, we laid out all of our facts, all of our legal conclusions, and explained why if we didn't bring a charge. So I would do that again. And lastly, using the skills we learned in law school, some of the one we did in the criminal procedure class, and applying them to these kind of cases where we're building cases, not just waiting for some viral video and responding, but looking at officer misconduct history, looking at yellow flags, looking at who a judge may have said, oh, I don't believe that person, and really taking a deep dive there and trying to head off some of these incidents we see before they happen.
Now, we don't really have that much time together left, Mr. Bragg, but I wanted to ask you, maybe, have you started to think about which one of your fellow candidates you would rank second and down the ballot? Has that come across your mind?
This is very important, because it's going to be the creation of some confusion for mayor, controller, borough president, city council. Ranked choice votes. But in the Manhattan District Attorney's office, because the DA's office is governed by state law, one of 62 DAs statewide. And so the law is different. There's no ranked choice voting. You only get one vote. I hope people want to vote for me, so I ask for their vote. And so there's no ranked choice voting. It's the old-fashioned way. You bubble in one name. I guess the really old-fashioned way would be you pull the lever. But you get my point. Only one candidate can you choose in this race, and I respectfully hope and ask that be me.
That's super important. Even I didn't know that. That's man. How are people supposed to see that on their ballot?
It is really, I think, something that we've been trying to, as a campaign, do some public education about.
Okay.
It's challenging because obviously the Board of Elections is doing voter education on ranked choice voting at the same time. And actually, one of the major papers got this wrong the other day and actually was encouraging people to do ranked choice voting and included the DA's office in that race. So people were very clued in and following this closely have made the same mistake. And so it's incumbent upon us as a campaign to really educate voters and say, one vote, one candidate for this race. We don't want folks getting their ballots tossed because they've, bubbled in multiple people.
And so my final question for you is, if you win, you become the city's first Black district attorney. And my question is, how would you internalize that? How would you feel about, carrying that distinction and it going towards your legacy? I know it's a little premature, but I would imagine that it, definitely is something that's weighing on your mind. If you win, you definitely, basically start carrying that torch forward. How do you start to think about that?
It is definitely something that I've thought about. And, Ken Thompson, the district attorney in Brooklyn, was a dear friend. And I've talked to some other heads of prosecutorial offices around the country who also sort of the first Black person in their jurisdiction. Look, I want to carry it forward with the same thesis I've campaigned on, which is, kind of pairing public safety and community trust, and really carrying that message forward if elected, through all of our communities, and not just sort of being a DA that's down in court, but one that is out in communities, sharing that message, and that life story of someone who's been stopped, of someone who's had a loved one re-enter and live with him, someone who's had the Warren squad at his door, and also someone who's had a knife at his neck and a homicide victim on his doorstep, and saying, look, this is a joint endeavor for all of us. We've all, are affected by fairness and safety. And yes, the DA's office has a role to do. We'll do it, we'll run it, but we're going to do it in partnership with communities and really focus on people who've been most affected and listen to those stories and be informed by them.
Alvin Bragg, candidate for Manhattan District Attorney. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. And, this is going to be a riveting interview. I'm excited to release it to our listeners with you.
No, definitely. Look, I just thank you for having me on, and it's great to see you, and great to talk, and great to engage with your listeners. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And vote on June 22nd or during early voting.
Vote on June 22nd.